first time anyone saw him, it was late October. The pass had already taken its first snowfall, and the sky above the Bitterroots hung heavy and grey. A lone figure came walking down the trail into the valley, with nothing but a crude pack slung across his back and a long-handled axe over his shoulder. His clothes were rough but intact, his beard unkempt, his eyes the colour of wet slate. He said his name was Elijah Griggs, and that was about all he said. He didn't ask for anything, didn't stop to rest. He just nodded once at the men unloading barrels at the general store and kept walking through the muddy main street toward the tree line. Most of the townsfolk figured him for a drifter, some broken-down trapper maybe, past his prime, and looking for solitude. They'd seen plenty like him over the years, men who came out of the high country speaking little, carrying less, and building their lives around silence. They usually didn't last long. A winter in that stretch of Idaho territory could break a man just as quick as a bear could, and folks knew better than to meddle with whatever ghosts drove a man to want to live alone. But what caught people's attention wasn't Elijah's quiet, it was the way he worked. He didn't fell trees with the rhythm of a tired man, didn't move like someone weathered and worn out. He moved with a kind of purpose, a violent efficiency that made it hard to look away. Within 3 days of arriving, he'd cleared a parcel of land on a ridge above the valley floor and begun raising a cabin, not with lumber bought from town, not with cut boards or milled timber. He used raw trees, stripped by hand, split by wedge and mallet, and no one ever saw him use a saw, no hammer, no nails, just that axe and a tool that looked like it was forged by hand, a kind of crooked adze with a wrapped leather grip. Children crept up the trail to watch him work when their chores allowed. He didn't chase them off, but he didn't speak either. He'd split a log down the grain, shape it smooth with that bent blade tool, and lift it alone into place with a rope pulley rig he'd built from scratch. There was something eerie about how quickly it all went up. By the end of the second week, the shells stood chest high. By the end of the month, a chimney rose from the center, and a roof of bark shingles covered the whole thing like scales, and not a single nail in the place. Some townsfolk were amused, others uneasy. One man, a logger named Seth Draper, laughed loudest. "Ain't a single joint in that thing that'll hold once the wind rolls through. That's not a cabin, that's a coffin with windows." The barroom crowd found that funny, said the hermit was building his own grave. They joked about how long it'd take before he came crawling back down hungry, begging for flour or sugar. But Elijah never came back down. Through November, the wind howled across the pass and the first hard snow buried the trails. The town settled into its winter rhythm. Chores doubled, tempers flared, ice gathered thick on eaves, and wagons froze to the mud. But the ridge above town stayed silent. No one saw smoke, no tracks. Some assumed the cabin had been abandoned already. A few said they'd heard strange hammering up there during a storm, said it sounded like someone knocking from under the ground. It wasn't until spring that people realized Elijah was still alive. He came down in April, just as the snow was giving up its grip on the valley, carrying a bundle of cured pelts and a hand-carved walking stick, traded for salt, flour, and 2 books, one a Bible, the other a discarded copy of a carpenter's manual someone had left behind in the general store. He spoke little, paid in full, and returned up the ridge without fanfare. But someone noticed something odd in his hands that day. Not just the stick, but the way the joints were carved. Perfect, like joinery from a shop. The handle was pinned with a round hardwood peg that looked burned at the edges. That wasn't just decoration, that was dowel work. Old, slow, precise, furniture-level joinery out of the wilderness, built with nothing but an axe and patience. It didn't matter much at the time. Folks were busy with the thaw, clearing roads, fixing roofs. But the gossip started again, about how he hadn't died, about how his cabin hadn't blown over, about how his firewood must have held through a brutal winter, because no one had seen him hauling more. One morning in June, the preacher's wife came down from a walk on the ridge and said she'd passed by Elijah's place, called it unnaturally tidy, said there wasn't a scrap of waste outside, no pile of discarded bark, not even a chip of wood out of place, just a clean rectangle of cabin and a small fenced garden, perfectly aligned with the slope. "It's too neat," she said. "Not a man's work. It looks designed." That word stuck, because that's what it started to look like. Designed. Not cobbled together like most cabins in the area. Not rough-hewn, but thought through. Every joint interlocking, every beam weight-balanced, every angle precise. The door sat flush like it had been planned. The shutters closed tight enough to keep out light. The chimney sat dead center and never smoked crooked, not once. Men who built cabins for a living began to get curious. Not openly, of course. Pride got in the way. But you could tell when one of them passed by the ridge trail and slowed to look uphill. They'd glance, shake their heads, and walk on faster. It might have ended there. Elijah might have just stayed the eccentric man on the ridge, building furniture with no tools and carving dovetail joints by firelight. But the flood changed everything. It came in early August, after 3 days of rain that wouldn't let up. The valley creeks swelled fast, then burst, carrying debris and runoff down through the lowland trails. At first it looked manageable. Then the northern dam, built 20 years earlier, and never properly reinforced, gave way. The torrent ripped through the north end of town like a dropped axe. It tore fences from the ground, sent wagons spinning like toys, and flooded the lower barns within hours. The townspeople scrambled to pull supplies and animals to higher ground, but the water kept coming. The eastern road collapsed in a sheet of mud, and the central bridge twisted in the current and snapped. By nightfall, most of the town had retreated to the hill behind the church. Cold, wet, cut off. 2 children were missing. An old man had been swept into a gully, trying to save his mules. Panic took root. That's when Elijah showed up. He came down the ridge with a thick pole strapped across his shoulders, 2 rope bundles at his side, and a woven pack full of tools no one recognized. Without a word, he walked to the shattered bridge, assessed the wreckage, and set to work. He didn't ask permission, didn't wait for help, just started tying ropes around trees and laying logs with angles no one else would have thought of. Within hours, he'd constructed a crude footbridge using triangular brace joints no one in town could name. It held. 20 people crossed that night, some carrying food, some carrying the wounded. By morning, Elijah had cleared a path through the worst of the debris and directed volunteers to start reinforcing the slope with logs he notched and wedged by hand. His movements were sharp, methodical, exacting, not rushed, not careless, and for the first time the town listened. The sheriff, a man not used to being ignored, tried to redirect the work. Elijah didn't argue. He didn't even look up, just said, "You build wrong, it breaks," then kept working. And the thing was, nothing he built broke. Every brace held, every joint stayed firm. The floodwaters slowed by the second day, and with Elijah's direction, they'd rerouted 2 channels and reinforced the church foundation with a stone buttress so solid that years later it would be mistaken for original construction. When the worst was over, the town gathered in the churchyard, exhausted, wet, shaken, but alive. Elijah stood apart, staring downhill toward the river, his hands black with ash and mud. Someone asked where he'd learned to build like that. He didn't answer. Someone else asked if he'd come down for the harvest dance. He walked away. They let him go. But something shifted after that. People started walking up the ridge, not in groups, just 1 or 2 at a time, dropping off sacks of grain, bolts of cloth, a new kettle, no words exchanged, just gestures, a slow, quiet acknowledgement that whatever they'd thought about him before had changed, that the man who'd built a home without nails or saws had also built a bridge that saved their children. And still Elijah didn't come to town, but his story was just beginning, because the flood hadn't just torn through the valley, it had unearthed something buried at the edge of town, something that would bring fear, suspicion, and finally violence. And when that moment came, it would be Elijah, the man they once mocked, who stood between them and ruin. The first sign came from a boy named Caleb, 11 years old, wiry and fast, always wandering too far. He'd been hunting frogs near the marsh's edge 2 weeks after the floodwaters receded when he saw bones. Too many, too long, not bleached like animal bones should have been. He ran home, breathless and pale, trying to explain what he'd found. His father dismissed it as cow bones. Caleb swore otherwise. "There were chains, Pa. In the mud, real chains, like cuffs." That got folks' attention. A small party rode out the next day, 3 men, a deputy, and the preacher. What they found stopped them cold. Near a tangle of uprooted trees and flood-scoured ground, half buried in black mud, was what remained of a pit, not a natural one, dug by hand, reinforced with stones and timbers, and inside it, bones, dozens, some still chained at the wrists, some smaller than they should have been. The preacher fell to his knees and crossed himself. The deputy turned and vomited. Word spread fast. By sundown, the whole town buzzed with questions, accusations, whispered suspicions. The history of that land, long ignored, now howled like a wound torn open. There'd been rumors long ago of a mining outfit that had vanished up that way in the 1820s. Something about a private claim, investors from back east, and workers who'd never returned. The ledgers claimed the mine dried up, but some of the old-timers had always muttered about screams in the valley during those early winters, about the men who came down thin-eyed and silent and refused to ever speak of the ridge again, but nothing solid. Until now there were were bones, manacles, evidence, and as unease hardened into fear, the town found itself in sudden need of answers and protection. That's when they turned to Elijah. It wasn't a decision made formally. There was no vote, no delegation. It happened in glances, in murmurs, in the way men leaned toward the ridge when the wind turned strange. Because whether they understood it or not, the moment they'd seen what Elijah built with his hands, the moment they'd watched him stand alone against the storm and shape order from chaos, they'd made a quiet pact. He was theirs now, or at least he was the best chance they had. Sheriff Lang rode up alone the next morning. He found Elijah at the edge of his garden, sharpening a draw knife against a whetstone. The man didn't look up. Lang cleared his throat. They found something, down where the flood hit hardest. Elijah didn't pause, just kept drawing steel over stone, each pull slow and even. Lang stepped closer. "We need your help. People are scared." The knife stopped. Elijah stood, wiped the blade with a rag, and finally met Lang's eyes. "What was buried should have stayed buried." Lang hesitated. "You know what it was? I know what men do when they think no one's watching." Elijah turned, walked to his cabin, and set the knife down on a bench. When he came back out, he wore a heavy coat and had tied a long-handled tool to his pack. Not a weapon exactly, more like a spade, but with a hooked end that looked custom forged. "I'll come," he said, "but I won't dig up ghosts for curiosity's sake." Lang nodded, unsure if that meant thanks or warning. When they arrived at the site, a crowd had already gathered, dozens of townsfolk standing in a rough circle around the pit. Someone had dragged up old boards to keep the curious from falling in. Someone else had laid out bones on a tarpaulin, lined up like a grim inventory. Elijah walked the perimeter in silence. When he stopped, it was in front of a stone half sunk in mud. He knelt, cleared it with his hands, and exposed a carved mark, weathered, nearly gone, but still visible. A triangle within a circle. Lang frowned. "What is it?" Elijah didn't speak. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small leather pouch, and removed a folded sheet of oilcloth. Inside was a scrap of yellowed paper. He held it up. The same symbol, hand-drawn, faded but exact. Lang looked from the paper to the stone. "What is that? A company mark?" Elijah stood slowly. "Worse, a family crest." The silence that followed stretched long. People stepped closer without meaning to. Elijah rolled the paper back up, returned it to his pouch. "In 1823, he said, a private expedition funded by the Redgate Syndicate came through these mountains. They weren't miners, not really. They were hunting something older. Iron veins, the tribe said, ran under this valley like roots, but the syndicate didn't believe in paying fair. They brought labor in chains. And when the winter turned, they made a choice. Keep digging or start burning bodies for heat." Lang's face went pale. "You were part of it?" "No, but my father was." Elijah turned and faced the pit again. "He escaped in spring, barely. Said the valley burned behind him like it wanted revenge. He told me never to come here, so I did the opposite." Someone in the crowd made a sound, half gasp, half prayer. Elijah looked at the bones. "Those aren't just dead men. That's a curse left unfinished." From that moment, the town changed. Not all at once, and not overtly, but the tension shifted. People who'd never locked their doors started doing so at night. Lanterns burned later. Dogs paced fences, and a fog settled over the ridge that didn't lift for 3 days. Then the animals started acting strange. Cattle refused to cross certain fields. Chickens stopped laying. Horses bucked at shadows. And one morning, the preacher's dog, a loyal mutt that had survived 2 harsh winters, was found dead on the chapel steps, throat torn, eyes open wide as if it had seen something no living thing should. The preacher called it a sign. The town called it coincidence. Elijah called it warning. He came down the ridge again, this time with purpose. Told the townsfolk they needed to build a barrier. Not a wall, but a ward. Something old, something carved. "They won't cross what's claimed," he said, "but it has to be made right." They asked who they were. He said nothing. Men who once mocked him now followed him into the woods. He showed them how to strip bark from alder trees, how to soak branches in ash water, how to bind stones with iron filings and bury them at crossroads. He marked symbols on doorways, burned herbs at midnight, and spoke words no one understood. Some resisted. The sheriff's deputy called it nonsense, called Elijah a madman with fancy words and backwoods tricks. That night his house caught fire. No cause found, no one hurt. But the deputy left town 2 days later and didn't return. By harvest, something had settled over the valley. Not peace, not quite fear, a kind of reverent silence. People stopped asking questions. They worked, nodded to each other, and left offerings at the base of Elijah's trail. A sack of oats, a bundle of firewood, a hand-sewn scarf. Gifts to the man on the ridge who'd built something stronger than a house. Because it wasn't just a cabin, and deep down, they knew it. Then the dreams began. Children woke crying, unable to explain why. Grown men reported voices whispering from behind their walls. The preacher said he'd seen a figure standing in his garden, tall, pale, with hollow eyes, but when he called out, it vanished. One woman, Widow Haskins, said her late husband had spoken to her in the night, told her not to go near the marsh, told her to stay near the fire. She hadn't lit one in weeks. She lit one that night. Elijah returned to town with a bundle wrapped in canvas, unrolled it in the church, a set of iron tools, blackened by time, carved with sigils that shimmered faintly in the candlelight. They left something behind, he said. Not just bones, something bound, but it's waking. He looked at Lang. I can seal it, but I need help. Lang nodded. Whatever you need. Elijah's eyes didn't blink. I need blood, willing blood. And just like that, the town's trust trembled. No one in town slept that night. The word blood lingered in their minds long after Elijah had walked back out into the darkness. The preacher claimed it was devil talk. The blacksmith said it was superstition. But the sheriff had seen Elijah hold back a flood with nothing but rope, wood, and will, and that memory clung tighter than fear. He gathered 5 men before dawn, all of them men who'd watched the river rise and lived because of Elijah's work. They didn't trust him exactly, but they respected the results. The group met him at the edge of his clearing just as the first pale light cut through the mist. Elijah's cabin stood silent and solid, the smoke from his hearth curling straight up through the grey air. He was already waiting, coat on, sleeves rolled high, a shallow wooden bowl on the table beside him. Lang spoke first. We came to hear what you mean to do, not a drop more or less. Elijah nodded once. Fair. He gestured toward the woods beyond the cabin, where the mist hung thicker. The flood didn't just uncover bones, it broke a seal. Whatever they buried down there wasn't meant to see daylight again. That place held things they took. Souls, maybe, or something older. Doesn't matter what word you use. They bound it in metal and blood. Now it's loose. And if we don't bind it again, it'll find warmth. Warmth? One of the men asked. Life, Elijah said. Yours, mine, anyone's. Lang crossed his arms. And this binding requires blood? Willing blood, Elijah said. The kind that chooses to hold something back, not spill it out. He lifted the bowl. Inside was a dark paste made from ash and what looked like crushed herbs. He took a small iron awl from his belt and pricked his thumb, letting a single drop fall into the mixture. It hissed softly, smoking like wet pine on coals. 1 drop for each man who means to stand here tonight, he said. No sacrifice, no pain, just proof to the thing below that this place isn't abandoned. The men hesitated. None moved. Finally, the blacksmith, Caleb's father, stepped forward, grim-faced and steady. He pricked his thumb, let a drop fall. Another man followed. Then Lang. When the 6th drop fell, Elijah stirred the mixture with the back of the awl and drew a symbol on the wooden wall beside the door, a circle intersected by 2 triangles. This marks you as part of it, he said quietly. From this day on, if you see that mark anywhere, it means you're standing on ground that's been claimed by the living. Lang frowned. Claimed from what? Elijah's gaze didn't waver. From what remembers. That evening, as dusk crawled down the ridges, they followed him to the marsh. The sun sank behind a veil of haze, and the air thickened until it felt like syrup in their lungs. They carried lanterns that barely cut the fog. At the edge of the pit, Elijah stopped. The bones had been gathered and reburied days earlier, but the ground itself seemed wrong, darker, damp, though it hadn't rained in days. The earth pulsed faintly, as if breathing. He unpacked his tools, a chisel, a hammer, a length of hollowed reed, a small clay pot filled with black pitch, and a square of cloth soaked in some dark oil. Every piece looked handmade, old, smoothed by use. He gave each man a task: cut the roots that hung across the pit, fetch water, stack stones. The work felt almost ordinary at first, but soon their hands trembled without knowing why. Then came the sound. At first it was distant, like water slapping stone, then closer, heavier, a deep rhythmic thud, as if something struck from below. The men froze. Lang's hand went to his revolver. Elijah raised a palm. It's just the earth settling, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He knelt at the edge, lit the oil-soaked cloth, and dropped it into the pit. The flame burned blue as it fell. For a heartbeat, it illuminated the mud below, and every man there saw it, a shape, broad, human, but twisted, its spine arched wrong, its arms too long. It wasn't moving, but it wasn't still. The blacksmith swore and backed away. What in God's name? Elijah's voice cut through. Not God's, theirs. He tipped the clay pot, pouring black pitch into the pit, then thrust the reed into the earth beside it. Smoke rolled up through the hollow shaft, thick and acrid. Lang gagged. What's that for? Sealing breath, Elijah said. Iron and ash, Close what blood opened. The pounding grew louder. The earth trembled. Lanterns flickered. Elijah slammed his hand against the symbol carved into the chisel's handle and drove it down into the mud. The sound that followed was not a crack or a rumble. It was a scream, muffled, deep, like air escaping lungs buried under stone. Men dropped their tools. The youngest ran. Lang stayed. So did the blacksmith. Elijah didn't stop until the chisel was buried to the hilt. Then he pressed his bleeding thumb against its head, whispering words none of them recognized. The earth stilled. Silence spread. When he finally looked up, sweat and ash streaked his face. "It's done," he said. "For now." Lang stared at the pit. What happens when "for now" ends? Elijah looked toward the town's distant lights. Then it looks for warmth again. They buried the pit under stones and ash. By morning, mist had swallowed the valley. The townsfolk awoke to find the air heavier than before, though no storm was coming. Children said they dreamed of chains dragging through water. The preacher refused to ring the church bell. Days passed in uneasy quiet. Then came the whispers. Not gossip this time, real whispers. Heard by men in their beds, women at their wash, children in their sleep. Always the same. He took what was ours. When the blacksmith's son, Caleb, went missing, everyone knew what they feared had only been delayed. It happened near dawn. The boy had gone to fetch water and never returned. They found his bucket lying in the grass halfway to the well. No tracks, no struggle, just the bucket and the faint smell of iron in the air. Lang rode hard for the ridge, found Elijah standing outside his cabin, eyes fixed on the horizon. "You knew this would happen," Lang said, breathless. "You knew." Elijah didn't deny it. "The binding holds the ground, not the hunger." "Then where is it?" Lang demanded. Elijah turned slowly, his face hollow. "Under the town?" Lang felt the bottom of his stomach drop. "How do you know that?" "Because the cabin's been humming. Since midnight." The sheriff listened and heard it, a faint vibration, like wind through taut wire, coming from deep under the logs. Elijah stepped aside and pried up one of the floor planks with his adze. Beneath it, the soil was trembling. Tiny flecks of black pitch bubbled through like oil. Elijah's expression darkened. "It's moving through the old tunnels. The mine. They built the town right over it." Lang felt sweat prick his scalp. "What do we do?" "We go down before it comes up." They gathered a small crew, 6 men again, same as before. Lanterns, rope, revolvers, nothing more. Elijah led them through the ravine north of the church, where the first shaft had collapsed decades ago. The entrance was half buried, but the timbers still stood, rotten and wet. The air that breathed out was cold enough to sting the lungs. Inside, the world narrowed to a tunnel of dripping stone. The further they went, the stronger the iron smell grew. The walls pulsed faintly with moisture, and sometimes, just for an instant, it looked like they were breathing. They found signs of the old mine first: broken carts, rusted picks, initials carved into beams. Then something newer, fresh claw marks on the walls. Lang raised his lantern. "What the hell could make that?" Elijah said nothing. At a bend in the passage, the air shifted. Ahead lay an open chamber, wide enough to stand a house in. The floor was slick, and at the far end stood a shape, a column of dark stone ringed by bones. Human, animal, unrecognizable. The thing pulsed faintly like a heart half beating. Elijah stepped forward. The air thickened. His lantern dimmed. "Stay back," he said. "If it sees you, it knows you." He approached the stone and laid his hand against it. For a moment everything stopped. The dripping, the breath, the hum, then a voice, not from the air but from the stone itself, deep and cold and full of memory. "You carry his blood," it said. "The builder, the breaker." Elijah's hand trembled. "And I'll end what he began." The chamber shuddered. A crack ran down the stone, oozing black pitch. The men behind him stumbled. Lang shouted something, but Elijah didn't move. He drove the chisel into the crack and screamed, not in fear, but fury. The light from his lantern flared white, blinding. When it faded, he was on his knees. The stone was silent. The hum was gone. They dragged him out before dawn, half conscious, burned along one arm. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough as gravel. "It's sealed again," he said. "But the ground won't forget." They asked what he meant. He didn't answer. He just looked toward the ridge where his cabin waited, solid as ever, and said softly, "If it comes again, it'll start with me." The next weeks brought calm. The boy returned, found wandering the ridge, dazed but unharmed. The preacher's bell rang again. Crops grew. The air cleared. People smiled in the streets. But at night, from the highest point in town, you could still see a faint, dull glow beneath the ridge, like embers under ash. And Elijah never slept more than an hour at a time, because deep in the dark below, the thing that remembered his blood wasn't gone. It was learning his name. By late autumn, the valley had returned to something like normal. The harvest had come in strong. No more disappearances. The fog had lifted. Even the livestock seemed calmer. From the outside, the town looked peaceful again. But underneath, Something had shifted, not just in the ground, but in the people. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew they'd been too close to something they couldn't name, something that didn't belong in the daylight. And every man, woman, and child in that valley owed their lives to a man who lived without nails, without saws, and without neighbors. Elijah Griggs had become a figure larger than myth, but he hadn't changed. He still came down the ridge only when necessary, still worked in silence, still answered questions with action rather than words. What had changed was the way people looked at him, with reverence, with guilt, with a quiet kind of fear. He didn't seem to want any of it. One Sunday morning, the preacher invited him to church, not in passing, but formally, from the pulpit. "The man who saved us walks among us," he said. "The least we can do is offer him a seat in the house of the Lord." Elijah didn't come. Instead, he left a small wooden cross on the preacher's doorstep, carved from mountain ash. No nails, no glue, just clean joints and smooth curves. Burned into the center was a simple circle, unbroken. The preacher kept it on the altar from then on, said it was the purest expression of faith he'd ever seen. But even as the town rebuilt itself, small signs returned. Not dramatic, not obvious, but persistent. The air inside cellars never felt quite dry. Wood warped in strange patterns. Tools left outside overnight rusted faster than they should. A baby was born with a mark on its chest, circular, faint, like the imprint of a coin pressed to flesh. The midwife swore it was just a birthmark, but her hands shook as she said it. Then there were the dreams, not the same as before, not nightmares. These were subtler. A woman woke up weeping for a child she never had. A ranch hand began speaking an old dialect in his sleep, a language no one recognized until the traveling peddler, a half-crow trader, said it was ancient Arikara, a tongue lost even to his people. The man had never met an Arikara. Elijah came down again that winter, brought with him a bundle of dried herbs and a set of finely carved symbols, small discs, each one different. He handed them to Lang and gave simple instructions. Bury one under each corner of every home in town. Lang didn't question him. The town obeyed. Still, some wondered, why now? Why still? That answer came during the first thaw of the new year. The snow melted. Fast that March, too fast. Creeks rose, then receded just as quickly, and with them came rot. Trees blackened from the roots up. Sooty mold crept across fence posts, and in the north pasture, a heifer gave birth to a calf that didn't breathe, but whose eyes were open. The blacksmith buried it deep, said nothing. Elijah watched all this unfold from the ridge, his expression unreadable. Then one night, he came down with a set of maps, not paper maps, wood, thin panels etched by hand with topography, elevations, river bends, timber lines. He laid them out in the schoolhouse by lantern light and called a meeting. Only a handful came. Lang, the blacksmith, the preacher, a few others. Elijah spoke plainly. This valley was never meant to be a home. They bristled at that. Lang pushed back. We've lived here nearly 30 years, and the thing buried beneath it has slept longer than that. Elijah pointed to a bend in the map where the river curved unnaturally. That isn't natural erosion, that's a scar. Whatever your ancestors built over, it's deeper than you think, and wider. He slid another panel into place, one showing a grid of lines beneath the surface. These are the tunnels, the preacher leaned in. How do you know that? I measured the humming. They stared. Elijah tapped the map again. Sound travels through ground. If you know what to listen for and where to place the points, you can map the hollow places. The blacksmith exhaled. You used your cabin, Elijah nodded, and the chapel, and the well, and a half-dozen other places you wouldn't think to measure. Lang frowned. What are we looking at here? A cage, Elijah said. But it's cracking. He leaned forward, voice lower. There's something moving, slowly, westward. The preacher paled. What does it want? Elijah didn't answer. He just looked out the window toward the hills. That week, the river ran backwards for 3 minutes. No one could explain it. Lang sent a rider to Fort Lewis to report the phenomenon. They never replied. The preacher started holding services daily, though fewer people came. And Elijah, he began building something new, not on the ridge, not near his cabin, but in a clearing half a mile west, where the pine trees grew stunted and the ground was always damp. He cleared the land with nothing but his axe and that strange adze, shaped timbers, set stones. But this wasn't a cabin. It had no walls. Instead, he dug 4 deep pits, lined them with stone, and built a kind of scaffold over each, angled beams, lashed with rawhide, interlocking like ribs. Then he raised a central column, taller than a man, carved from a single length of spruce. Burned into it was the same symbol, the circle. Lang came to watch one morning, silent. Elijah didn't look up. Lang cleared his throat. You going to tell me what you're doing? Building a seal, Elijah said. One that breathes? Lang stepped closer. That means something to you? Elijah turned, face gaunt. eyes rimmed red. "Everything alive breathes. So do the dead. So does what's underneath us. Most people build to shut things out, but that just builds pressure. If it wants out, it'll find a crack. So what's the point of this? To teach it rhythm," Elijah said. "To make it match our breath, not the other way around." Lang didn't pretend to understand, but he nodded. The construction took 3 weeks. No one helped, but everyone watched. Elijah never left the site. He ate there, slept there, worked through storms and sun. When it was finished, he lit 4 torches, 1 in each pit. The flames burned low and steady, never rising above the rim. Then he sat at the center column and waited. For 3 nights, he didn't move. On the 4th, the dreams returned. This time, the entire town dreamed the same thing. A circle of men underground, heads bowed, hands outstretched, surrounding a child who screamed without sound. Every person woke at the same time. Midnight. A bell that hadn't worked in years tolled once. The next morning, Elijah was gone. The seal stood empty. Lang found him back at the cabin, collapsed beside his hearth. His skin was cold, his eyes open, but his pulse still beat. He awoke hours later, coughing ash. When Lang asked what happened, Elijah said only this: "It took something from me." He never said what, but he moved slower after that. His hands shook, his voice rasped, and when he spoke, it was always in fragments. "It's not one thing," he told Lang once. "It's pieces, fractured, hungry for form." Lang pressed him. "How do we stop it?" "You don't," Elijah said. "You teach it shape, then you bury the shape." In October, the preacher's boy vanished for 4 hours. When he returned, he said he'd followed a voice into the woods, his mother's voice, though she'd been at home the whole time. He didn't remember what happened, but on his back was a smear of pitch in the shape of a spiral. Elijah examined it, scraped a sample, burned it. The flame turned green. That night, he began carving again. This time, not furniture, not tools, figures, each one shaped from different wood: pine, oak, cedar, each one painted with ash and blood, each one different in posture, expression, shape. He placed them at the corners of town, buried some, mounted others on posts. People called them totems. Elijah called them reminders. When someone asked what they reminded, he said, "That we're watching." But the carvings weren't static. They changed, slowly, subtly, week by week. A hand that had pointed one way would point another. A mouth carved open would close. One figure, meant to be blindfolded, had the cloth fall away. Beneath it, the eyes were open and weeping sap. People began to avoid them. Some moved away. Elijah stayed. So did Lang. Then came the shaking. Not an earthquake, not a tremor, but a slow, persistent hum that made windows rattle and breath catch. The seal burned low. The pitch pits began to smoke. Birds stopped flying over the clearing. And Elijah, now gaunt and grey, gathered Lang and the preacher for one last conversation. "It's not content with dreams anymore," he said. "It wants shape." The preacher whispered, "What kind?" Elijah didn't answer, but he rolled up his sleeve. On his arm was a mark, burned into the flesh. A spiral inside a triangle, inside a circle. "I've been marked," he said. "It chose me first." Lang's voice broke. "Can we stop it?" Elijah looked at the horizon. "No, but we can give it something better." And the next day, Elijah began building again. The sound of adze against wood echoed across the ridge, even through the thick late autumn fog. It was different from before, slower, heavier. There was strain behind it, like each stroke was carving more than wood. Elijah was building again, but it wasn't a cabin, it wasn't a bridge, and it wasn't something the townsfolk could easily name. He didn't explain it either. Lang asked once, watching from the tree line as Elijah bent low over a foundation of hand-set stones, laying out squared timbers that formed a shallow cross. "You building another seal?" he said. Elijah didn't look up. "No." Lang waited. Elijah drove a hardwood peg through 2 interlocking beams, pinning them in place with a small stone mallet. The sound rang out like a bell. "What is it then?" Elijah stood slowly, rubbing the back of his wrist, which now bore a second mark, this one fresher, raw, red. "A gate," he said. Lang's mouth went dry. "To let it out?" "No." Elijah's voice was hoarse, almost broken. "To let it choose." The timber frame took shape over the course of 2 weeks. It was low, almost flush with the earth, but wide, wider than any structure Elijah had built before. The frame formed an octagon, its beams set into the ground with stone footings, each joint lashed and pegged in a method no one had seen before. The wood was untreated, raw, but every surface had been planned and burnished with a dark oil that smelled faintly of pine and iron. At the center of the structure, Elijah erected a single vertical post, taller than a man and twice as thick. Upon it he carved no symbols, just a long, clean groove down the face, and at the base, a recess like a cup. Lang came again near dusk, when Elijah was smoothing the top of the post with a cloth soaked in ash water. "I don't like it," Lang said plainly. Elijah didn't stop working. "You're not supposed to." Lang stepped into the ring of beams. "You say it wants shape. What happens if it picks wrong?" Elijah wrung out the cloth, twisted it until grey water ran between his knuckles. "Then this valley becomes its skin," Lang swallowed, and when he spoke again, his voice was low. "You're making something that can't be undone." Elijah paused. "You ever notice," he said, "how no one in this town has written a letter in 3 months? Lang blinked. "What? No messages? No news from Fort Lewis? No traders from the East Trail? No peddlers? Nothing. This place has gone quiet, Lang. We're being isolated." Lang frowned. He hadn't thought of it, but it was true. Mail hadn't come in weeks. The trade wagons they expected in late September had never arrived. "You think it's behind that?" Elijah looked up, eyes rimmed with red, voice dry as frost. "It's surrounding us. Not with armies, with silence." That night, the preacher died. He'd been a fixture in the town for decades. Stubborn, pious, prone to dramatic warnings, but ultimately steady. Found slumped over his pulpit, eyes wide open, mouth stuffed with ash. No signs of struggle, no wounds. But on the back wall of the church, scratched into the wood by a blade or claw, was a shape. A circle inside a triangle, inside a spiral. Lang buried him himself. No one else would touch the body. That week, 5 more people left town, packed wagons under the cover of fog, and rode south, toward the fort, or anywhere that felt untouched. Elijah watched them from his ridge, expression unreadable. He didn't try to stop them, but he added something to the gate. At the edge of the octagon, he built a ring of stones, not tall but dense, each one engraved with symbols, each one placed according to some internal pattern only he seemed to understand. And into each he poured something black from a clay jar. When it dried, it hardened to a gleaming sheen like glass. Lang came again. He didn't ask questions, just watched. Finally, Elijah said, "They think they're escaping." Lang looked west, toward the tree line. "Aren't they?" "No." Elijah stepped back from the ring. "It's inside them already, in their dreams, in their marrow. They'll carry it until they sleep somewhere soft, and it'll settle in the soil there too. It wants to spread, but not in distance, in memory." Lang's jaw clenched. "Then why build this?" He gestured toward the octagon, the post, the stone ring. "Why give it anything?" "Because we can't keep burying it," Elijah said. "It's not afraid of soil. It's afraid of choice." Lang shook his head. "That makes no damn sense." Elijah looked at him. "The thing under us has no form, no will of its own. Not yet. It lives off what we give it. Fear, rage, pain. Every time it lashes out, it's trying to find a shape that fits. I'm going to give it one." "You?" Lang stepped back. "You're offering yourself?" Elijah nodded once. "You're going to let it take you?" "No," Elijah said. "I'm going to become something it can't use." The conversation ended there. Elijah went back to his work. Lang returned to town and said nothing. In the days that followed, the air turned colder. The fog returned. Nights grew longer than they should have. Chickens laid eggs filled with dust. A girl was born with no pupils in her eyes. 3 men disappeared from the North Road, and then came the bell. It rang once, deep and slow, from the chapel's ruined steeple, but the chapel was locked. No one had gone in. No one could have. The steeple stairs had collapsed during the flood. Lang ran there himself, found the door sealed, the pews untouched. But in the pulpit sat something new, a small figure, carved from mountain ash, with a circle burned into its chest. It was Elijah, or something shaped like him. That night the gate glowed. People saw it from their windows. Faint light, not flame, rising from the ridge like heat from a forge. The mist parted just enough to reveal the shape of the octagon, the tall post casting a long shadow toward town. Elijah stood at the center, and behind him, watching, was something else. No one saw it clearly. Some swore it had antlers. Others said wings. One man said it had no face, only mirrors. But they all agreed on one thing. It wasn't solid. It flickered like firelight on water. Elijah turned once to face the town, then raised both arms and the light vanished. In the morning the gate was cold. The torches burned out. The carved figures at the town's corners had cracked, split down the middle like dry wood. Elijah was gone. Lang went up the ridge alone, found the cabin empty, fire still warm, tools in place. But on the workbench sat a journal, bound in bark, written in charcoal, in a hand so tight it looked carved. Lang read it, then burned it. But he remembered what it said. There is no binding that holds forever. Only rhythm, only intention. We shape the dark, not by defeating it, but by giving it boundaries. When we forget those, it remembers us too well. Lang never told the town what he read. He just said Elijah was gone, that he had left them something more than safety, something harder, responsibility. In the weeks that followed, the fog lifted again. The soil dried. Crops held through the frost. No more disappearances. No more marks. But the gate remained, unchanged. Lang built a fence around it, told children not to go near, planted willows at each corner, and let them grow wild. He passed the story down, quietly, not as warning, but as reminder. And still, no one ever saw Elijah again. Not until the next spring, when a trader came down from the pass. He was ragged, half-starved, eyes red from wind and snow, said he'd gotten lost in a storm and taken shelter in a hollow above the ridge. Said there was a man there, tall, silent, pale as ash, who gave him food, showed him which stars to follow, and carved him a walking stick before vanishing into the trees. The stick had no nails, no seams, no saw marks, just perfect joints, and a spiral burned into the grip. When Lang held it, he felt a faint hum, deep, steady, calm. That night he went to the gate and listened. Winter gave way to spring with a kind of reluctant grace. The valley greened late that year, and even when the buds swelled on the trees and the rivers receded into their rightful banks, the people of the town carried themselves differently. Not in fear, at least not entirely, but with the subdued caution of a community that had, for a time, lived on the threshold of something too large, too old, and too silent to name. They worked their fields, repaired their fences, and blessed their meals, but even the laughter of children seemed more hushed now, like they were all still listening for something beneath the soil. Lang, now older and stiffer in his stride, made it his duty to check the gate every week. He didn't call it that, not aloud. Some of the younger men who'd stayed behind after the worst of it began referring to it as the Stone Circle or Griggs Ring. But Lang knew better. It was a gate, not to something else, but to something within the land, within the town, within themselves. The octagonal frame Elijah had built remained intact through storm and snow. The central post was still upright, untouched by rot, unwarped by frost. The strange stone ring that surrounded it had darkened further, the etched lines barely visible now under a sheen of hardened pitch. Lang would walk the perimeter each visit, counting the paces, checking for cracks, listening for the faint hum that had once whispered under his boots like breath under floorboards. Most weeks, he heard nothing, but on the first day of May, he found something new. Not damage, construction. Someone had added to the ring. It wasn't obvious at first, but Lang's eye, sharpened by years of patrol, noticed the difference. A small figure, no more than a hand tall, carved from dogwood, had been placed at the northern point of the octagon. It resembled a person, seated with its hands covering its ears. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth hollows where features should be. Lang didn't touch it. He circled the gate again. At the western point, he found another, identical in posture, but carved from dark pine. This one covered its mouth. And to the east, a third, same figure, same wood, but this one covered its eyes. He recognized the symbolism, old, ancient even. See no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. But why here? Why now? He returned to town and spoke to no one. That night, he sat in his kitchen beside a dwindling fire and remembered the walking stick the trader had brought, the spiral carved into the grip, the hum it gave off when held. Lang fetched it from its spot beside the door and brought it to the table. He turned it slowly in his hands, feeling the wood, noting the pattern. That's when he realized something. The spiral on the stick, the one Elijah had burned into the wood, it matched the placement of the totems. The spiral had 3 points where the curve doubled back on itself, forming a rough triangle, and each one corresponded to the position where Lang had found the figures. It wasn't a warning. It was a map. Lang spent the next day in the archives, the back room of the old schoolhouse, where land deeds, maps, and mining records had been stored for decades in crates no one bothered to catalogue. He spent hours turning yellowed pages, studying plats and surveyor marks, tracing the outlines of the valley with shaking fingers. And then he found it, a deed from 1822, listing a parcel of land sold to the Redgate Syndicate. The plot description was vague: natural borders, creek forks, known mineral-rich hillocks. But Lang cross-referenced it with a more modern map and realized the truth. The gate wasn't built in isolation. It sat at the exact center of 5 historical sites: the original mining entrance, the oldest homestead, burned in 1831, the abandoned chapel, not the current one, the first one, now just a stone shell, a collapsed well, and a long-forgotten burial ground that had been built over with a livestock pen. 5 points, the gate at the center, and the totems were placed not as barriers, but as locks that Elijah had either placed before his final disappearance or had taught someone else to place afterward. Lang closed the books, locked the door behind him, and rode up the ridge that same night. He carried the walking stick, a lantern, and a loaded rifle. But when he reached the gate, someone was already there. A woman stood in the mist beyond the circle, facing the central post. She didn't flinch when Lang approached. He recognized her, Alma Paxton, daughter of the midwife. She couldn't have been more than 22 now, but she carried herself like someone much older. People said she'd always been strange, talked to animals, carved symbols into trees, sang in old tongues when she walked alone. She held something in her hand. Lang raised his lantern. "What are you doing out here, Alma?" She didn't turn. "Listening. To what?" She tilted her head. "The rhythm." Lang stepped closer. "What do you have there?" Alma turned slowly. In her palm sat a small carving, freshly whittled, a figure, different from the others. This one had no hands at all. Its arms were crossed, its face blank, its chest hollowed into a tiny bowl. Lang stared. "That's new." "Yes," she said. "Where did you learn to make that?" Alma looked toward the gate. "He showed me." "Elijah?" She nodded once. Lang felt the chill slide down his spine. "He's still out there?" Alma smiled faintly. "He's part of it now." She stepped past Lang and placed the figure at the southern point of the octagon, the final direction. Then she stepped back, and as she did, the air shifted, the wind died, the mist flattened, and the earth beneath the gate groaned, not like wood bending, but like stone grinding against stone, a slow, deep sound that crawled up Lang's legs and settled behind his heart. He raised the walking stick instinctively. It hummed in his hand. Alma stepped back toward the tree line. "He said it's awake now, but still bound. For now." Lang stared at the post. "What did he give it?" She turned. "Memory." Then she was gone. Lang didn't sleep that night, nor did most of the town, because as dawn broke, a sound like distant bells echoed from the ridge. Not church bells, but deeper, older, the kind that ring underwater, the kind you feel in your teeth. And the marks returned. Not in the soil, not on skin, but in wood. Every house in town, every barn and fence post, somewhere somehow, had a knot in the grain that now bore a shape, a spiral inside a triangle, inside a circle. People panicked. Some packed to leave, others stayed locked inside. Lang did what he could to calm them, but the truth was he had no explanation. Only one idea. He went back to the gate. This time he crossed the threshold. Nothing happened immediately, but as he approached the central post, he felt the pressure in the air, like diving too deep, ears straining to catch something that wasn't sound. At the base of the post, the groove Elijah had carved was now filled with something solid, not stone, not wood, something smooth and dark and warm to the touch. Lang pressed his palm against it, and suddenly he was somewhere else. Not a place, not exactly, more like a memory, but not his. A man stood before him, hammer in hand, sweat on his brow. He was young, too young, and afraid. Behind him, a pit, inside it, chains, movement, and a voice whispering from the dark. "You built us, now you must feed us," the man sobbed, dropped the hammer, stepped back. Then Elijah appeared, not from the past, not from memory, but as he had been on the ridge, gaunt, marked, eyes bright with something ancient. He looked at Lang. "This is the shape it remembers," Lang gasped. Then it was gone. He staggered back, heart hammering, and on the post, the groove was empty again. Lang rode straight to town, gathered every man and woman who would listen, and told them what he'd seen. "It's not about sealing it," he said. "It's about showing it who we are. Every time we forget, it grows stronger. Every time we bury the past, it burrows closer." Someone asked what to do. Lang paused. Then he said, "We remember." He led them up the ridge, showed them the gate, the totems, the carvings, and together they began to carve new ones. Figures of kindness, of grief, of sacrifice. Some bore tools, some carried children. One had a spiral in its chest, but it smiled. They placed them around the ring, left them unguarded, and the fog lifted. That night, every person in town dreamed the same dream. Elijah stood at the gate, and behind him, 1,000 figures, not twisted, not monstrous, but human, holding hands, watching, waiting. The dream lingered long after sunrise. Dozens of townsfolk woke in cold sweats, tears drying on their cheeks, unable to remember the full shape of it, but still feeling its weight in their bones. It wasn't fear that gripped them, not exactly. It was something deeper, grief mingled with awe, like they'd been allowed to witness something vast and sacred, something not meant for waking minds. Children described it more clearly than the adults. One little girl said she saw a forest of people, standing still like trees, with light coming out of their chests. A boy said they were singing without mouths. A widow murmured it felt like forgiveness. And across the ridge, the wind carried no sound for the first time in living memory. Lang was the first to speak of it aloud. He called a meeting not in the town hall or the chapel, but at the gate. They gathered in the early dusk, around the octagonal ring, eyes wide, voices hushed. Alma was there too, sitting near the southern marker, whittling quietly. She didn't speak unless spoken to. The preacher's replacement, a quiet man named Tobias, who had arrived a month prior, stood with folded hands, uncertain whether to bless the ground or kneel before it. Lang didn't make a speech. He just knelt and placed the walking stick at the center of the gate. "This valley has been shaped by what we tried to bury," he said, voice low. "Not just bones, but mistakes, memories. We spent years building over things we should have remembered, and that made space for something else to take root." No one interrupted. Even the birds held their breath. "Elijah gave us a map," Lang continued, "not to hide from it, but to face it, to give it form, to show it the truth of what we are, not the lie we've been telling." He gestured to the ring of carved figures, now doubled in number. The new ones had been placed carefully, a mother cradling a child, a man holding an axe but with his head bowed, a youth with a flower carved into his chest. "It can't feed on what we don't hide," Lang said, "and it can't become what we don't allow." A murmur spread through the crowd. Agreement, relief, something like understanding. Then the wind shifted, not a gust, a pulse. The torches along the outer pits, which hadn't been lit in months, flickered into flame all at once. No spark, no match, just sudden fire. People screamed. Some stepped back, but Alma stood, slowly, and approached the central post. "It's listening again," she said. The earth trembled, not violently, just enough to make dust rise from the stone ring. The walking stick at the center vibrated, tipped slightly, and then stopped. Lang stepped forward. "What does it want?" Alma didn't take her eyes off the post. "A witness." That night, Lang stayed at the gate while the others returned to town. Alma remained as well, silent as the moon drifted through cloud-streaked sky. The fire in the pits never went out, but never grew hotter either. It warmed without consuming. It illuminated without casting hard shadows. Sometime past midnight, Lang heard it. Voices, not loud, not distinct, but layered, overlapping. Whispers in 100 tongues he didn't know yet understood. They didn't speak to him, not directly. They recited memories, names, fragments of grief. A mother sobbing over a lost child. A man begging for forgiveness. A child asking to go home. Alma touched the post and said softly, "They want to be remembered." By dawn, Lang understood what had to be done. The next day, he began compiling a book, not a journal, but a record. He called it The Ledger of the Gate. It wasn't history in the traditional sense. There were no dates, no timelines. It was filled instead with truths, acknowledgements, confessions, stories that hadn't been spoken aloud for years, sometimes decades. Each page bore a single memory, signed by hand. The first was his own. "In 1839, I looked away when the syndicate came through. I knew what they did. I pretended I didn't. I built a fence with their wood. I said nothing. I remember it now." Other entries followed. A farmer admitted to turning away a starving family. A widow confessed to hiding her sister's illness for fear of shame. A child wrote, "I hated my brother for being braver than me." Alma wrote only one line, "I followed the whispers, and they led me to myself." Within weeks, the ledger filled 2 whole volumes, and the gate changed again. The carvings shifted subtly. Some aged, some darkened. One, placed near the eastern stone, split in half, and from the crack grew a shoot of green, a sapling that bloomed white in the dead of winter. The preacher, Tobias, began holding services there. Not sermons, not prayers, but readings. Each week, someone volunteered to read a page from the ledger. No commentary, no shame, just words, heard and held. The valley grew quieter, not empty, not eerie, but peaceful. Even the animals seemed calmer. Herds moved with more ease. Birds nested closer to homes. Dogs stopped barking at empty corners, and children laughed again, full-bodied, without hesitation. Then came the rain. Not a flood, not a storm, just a soft, steady rain that lasted 3 days and nights. It soaked the earth, cleaned the air, filled the barrels, and softened the ground until everything smelled like renewal. It was the kind of rain that coaxed green from gray, life from rot, and when it stopped, a new figure stood at the center of the gate. No one had seen it placed. It wasn't carved from wood, but from stone, smooth, black, polished. It stood just shy of a man's height. No face, no limbs, just a spiral etched into its chest, and below it, the faint impression of a cabin door. Lang approached it alone. He placed a hand on the stone. It was warm, and he remembered. Not the dream, not the memory, but the truth. Elijah Griggs had not disappeared. He had not fled. He had not been taken. He had become, not a god, not a ghost, a shape. The first shape the darkness could not claim. The one who remembered, the one who chose. That night, Lang returned to the cabin. The one Elijah had built without nails, without saws. It still stood, perfectly square, tight as the day it was built. He opened the door for the first time in over a year. Inside, nothing had changed. The tools were still hung neatly on pegs. The fire pit was clean. A chair sat beside the window, overlooking the valley. Lang sat. He waited, and as the stars came out over the ridge, he felt it, just beneath the floorboards. A hum, faint, familiar, not a warning, a welcome. The gate was no longer a prison. It was no longer a threshold. It was a story, written in wood and stone and ash, passed from hand to hand, voice to voice. It would be remembered, and the valley would never forget. Spring turned to summer, without the usual fury of storms or the creeping mold that once clung to the edges of cabins after every thaw. The valley changed, not in ways that outsiders would note, not at first glance, but in the way a healed scar reshapes the strength of skin. The people carried themselves differently now, not in fear, not in triumph, in reverence, as if the land around them breathed alongside their own lungs. And the gate still stood. Elijah's structure, once ridiculed as eccentric madness, now served as the quiet heart of a community that had learned not to explain everything, but to witness it. Children were taught to carve, not just animals or toys, but figures. They whittled small effigies from alder and pine, ash and birch. Each had a story. Not all stories were happy. Some held sorrow, others shame, but all were remembered. The ledger of the gate grew. By midsummer, it filled 7 volumes. Lang had grown old in the process. His hair had turned nearly white. His shoulders stooped, but his mind had only sharpened with time. He no longer carried his rifle. Instead, he carried the walking stick, the one the trader brought down from the mountains, the one Elijah had carved. It never stopped humming. When strangers came through now, and they did more often than before, they found a town that seemed ordinary on the surface. A chapel, a store, stables and homes, laughter in the evening, smoke from cooking fires. But beneath it, they felt something else. Stillness, a presence. Some said the air was cleaner, that their thoughts slowed when they crossed the river. Others said the valley made them dream. Odd dreams, vivid, deep. Many stayed. Some were drawn to the gate, even if they didn't know why. They'd sit in silence at the edge of the octagon, watching the way the central stone caught light at dusk, how the outer torches never needed relighting, how the carved figures grew weathered but never decayed. One young woman, a painter from the coast, arrived in late July. She'd lost her husband in a fire the year before and wandered for months without purpose. She stayed 2 nights, then 3. On the 4th, she placed a figure at the north point of the gate, an open hand holding a small flame. She didn't explain it. She didn't have to. Lang saw her weeping beside the central post one morning. He approached slowly, sat with her. She asked only one question. "Does it remember everyone?" Lang nodded. "Everyone who leaves something behind." She stayed the rest of the summer, and she wasn't the only one. A scholar from back east arrived with pages of notes on local geology, seeking to study the strange harmonics in the soil. He never published a single paper, but he built a small library on the southern slope and began transcribing the ledger by hand into volumes he called The Testimonies. A veteran, hollow-eyed and quiet, passed through on his way to the mountains. He stayed long enough to carve a figure of himself, kneeling, head bowed, hands open, and placed it west of the gate. Then he left. A year later, a letter arrived from his mother. He died in Montana, peacefully. She had no idea he'd ever pass through. They buried the letter beneath his figure. The people of the valley didn't speak of the gate as a miracle. They didn't boast of Elijah. They didn't warn travelers away or draw them in. They simply lived, with awareness, with honesty, with a shared understanding that memory was not a burden to be buried, but a rhythm to be kept. It wasn't perfect. Arguments still happened. Crops still failed some seasons. Illness came and went, but nothing vanished anymore. No one disappeared in the night. No strange shapes whispered from the soil. Because they listened, because they remembered. Lang continued his walks up the ridge each week, even as his knees stiffened and his breath shortened. He'd sit beside the central post, press his hand to the spiral groove, and feel it, the deep, slow pulse of something that wasn't hunger, wasn't darkness, but memory. And sometimes he'd hear the voice, not Elijah's exactly, not human, but shaped like him. It would whisper names, places, events long past, not to haunt him, but to recite them, as if reading aloud from the ledger, as if practicing. Sometimes it would say, the man who carved without nails, the man who stood in the flood, the man who remembered his father's failure and built not a home, but a promise. Lang would close his eyes and listen, and when he was too old to walk, the children would carry him there in a cart. They would place his hand on the post and let him rest in the hush of remembered things. On the last day of his life, Lang asked to be buried just outside the octagon, beneath the oldest willow, not inside. He said the gate was for the living. His carving had already been placed years earlier. A man seated beside a lantern, holding an open book. The morning after his funeral, the The torches lit themselves, the wind blew south, and someone found a new figure at the center of the gate. No one had seen it placed. No one knew who carved it. It was smaller than the others, made of two woods joined with seamless dowels, mountain ash and ironwood. Its hands were open, its feet rooted into a base that bore a single mark, a circle, unbroken. The ledger grew slower after that, but never stopped. Alma became its caretaker. She grew older too, her hair silver, her voice low, still singing those strange songs when she walked alone. Children followed her up the ridge each month to place new figures, to sit beside the post and listen. Sometimes, if the air was still, the soil beneath them would hum, and they would hum back. The valley became known for its stillness, a place of peace, but not emptiness, a place where memory was honored like weather, accepted like nightfall. And the cabin? It still stood. Elijah Griggs's cabin, built without nails, without saws, without plans, still square, still strong, never creaked in storms, never settled in frost. It was visited often, but never lived in again. A man once tried to buy it, offered coin, trade, land. He walked inside, walked out pale, never asked again. The people never boarded it up, never called it sacred. They just respected it, let it be, like Elijah had done with the land, because that was the lesson. He hadn't sealed something away, he hadn't conquered it, he hadn't driven it out, he'd given it form, and by giving it form, he gave it a place, and by giving it a place, he taught it what a home meant, and by remembering it, by carving their grief, their love, their guilt, their joy, the people of the valley gave it memory, and memory, they learned, was the only thing stronger than fear. So when storms came now, they placed figures by the gate. When babies were born, they were brought to the ridge, hands pressed to the post. When someone died, their name was added to the ledger. And when someone forgot themselves, when pain or pride made them cruel, they were not cast out. They were walked, hand in hand, up the path, to the gate, to remember, to choose again. And the gate stood, and the post stood, and the hum never stopped, and the valley endured. Because one man, mocked, exiled, alone, built something without nails, without saws, and without apology. Not just a cabin, but a memory that could not be unmade.